All right, guys, what is up? Haven't done a spaces in a while, so I thought it would be pretty interesting to start one in light, I guess, of the recent events that have been happening lately. And we're waiting on a different figure. If you follow me, you probably don't know who this is. Jack of Faces. He's not in yet, but we're waiting for him to join. He has more of a spiritual perspective on things and breaks it down more energetically. Oh, there he is. Speak of the So yeah, in the space, we're just gonna talk about. I saw a tweet from Jack about the timeline shift, and I thought it'd be interesting if he came on, broke it down a little bit. I think it'd be interesting for the people who follow me to see a different perspective, and then obviously, I'm sure Jack has a pretty loyal audience, and hopefully, you guys find what I say insightful as well. So thanks for coming on, Jack.
What's up? Thanks for having me. How's everyone doing?
Yeah, hopefully everyone is good. But yeah, I'm gonna find the tweet. I'm gonna pin it at the top of the space. But yeah, do you want to kind of break down what you meant about the tweet you put out about the another here? I'll pin it right now in the space. But it was another collective shift is occurring as we speak. We are now three times farther away from the good timeline compared to when the first split occurred. Humanity's majority chooses inaction once again. If you followed my posts and built your spaceship, be proud and use it well. Don't let the world bring you down. Keep creating.
It sounds very cliche, right? But yeah, sure. I can sort of like touch on that. And the promise, disclaimer, whatever, is that it sounds a lot more pretentious than it is, because the moment you start using words like timeline and shift and so basically when we start to talk about humanity as like this collective whole, right? Like there's this inherent pretentiousness that the whole ordeal has, and especially like if you're the one saying it, right? So I will try to explain it, like you said, from, I guess, from an energetic standpoint or whatever, like however is whatever is the most presentable and closest to the abstract truth, which is a very complex truth, but it's also presentable and can be sort of like deciphered. And usually, like how we'll do this, I believe the question is holy. So what I will do is like, when a question arises, then you'll answer the question, and it'll sort of lead you down this, more of a sophisticated conversation. So I'm sure, like, I'll learn some stuff from you, you'll learn some stuff from me, and like we'll have a bunch of questions and stuff like that, so we can explore that. But primarily, like you, I think, um, and thank you for understanding the complexity of this topic, right? When you asked me like, hey, you want to hop on a spaces, that gave me a sort of a prelude to like, you sort of understand that there's more going on behind the scenes. Um there's a recognition in that, right, that we share in common. So primarily, I think you have to understand fundamentally what quote unquote a timeline shift is, at least what I mean by it, before we get to, well, why it's happening and how it's happening and blah blah blah. So I guess let's start from the basics. um, a timeline shift assumes that there is a collective consciousness, and that there is such a thing as a collective subconscious and a collective unconscious. So a timeline shift is nothing more than the collective awareness of all sentient humans, which is connected through a sort of like a familial common ancestry, uh, those types of grounds. It means that we have reframed the perspective through which we view reality as a whole. And the collective consciousness or collective awareness of mankind as a united sort of like entity, basically what we're saying, has reframed its understanding of its own experience. So when you're dealing with um let's say, international crises, or large political movements, and the political arena sort of like destabilizing, and there's being like negative news and so on and so forth, that inadvertently affects the collective consciousness, obviously, but also the collective subconscious. What the Jungian shadow, if it was scaled up to this very ambitious, immense metric, that being, if the universe viewed each individual as a singular piece, but then also viewed the collective also as a singular piece. So basically, the argument there is that whenever these large scale events occur, there are impressions and feelings and emotions that are attached to the collective consciousness. And because that happens, the collective subconsciousness and the unconsciousness also shifts. So these programs that exist within this sort of like void space, right, that humanity is unaware of, right, that starts manifesting in the physical world more and more through a variety of means, right, and on a variety of layers. So when we say we shift it into a different timeline, well, the general consensus on that, I think, in spiritual and esoteric circles are the same as mine. Mine is just a different reinterpretation, right? Where I say that Earth, in and of itself, right, as a living sort of like bioship, is capable of shifting from one friendly quantum reality to the other, right? And there's an incredible array, there's a plethora of information that links all of these little mythologies and historical facts and so on and so forth together to basically give you an ample amount of information to at least be able to consider that as a potential truth of, well, where you are. So when we say a timeline has shifted, and we'll get to that, I guess, in more detail with questions, we say that the consensus reality has been redirected because the lens through which reality as a thing, like as a concept, as a whole, has been reframed on a collective level.
Well, I kind of have I kind of want to jump in real quick. So, do these shifts happen? I guess by accident, or is someone kind of steering the direction of where the collective consciousness goes to? Like, is there one domino that falls first that leads to this kind of collective consciousness shift?
So it's like, regardless of how we put it, um if you follow the rule set of as above so below, um you must understand that the collective consciousness as an entity basically also functions as an individual consciousness would. So when an individual consciousness, like, let's say on a psychology level, even, let's forget about the esoteric, right, experiences a traumatic event, the first thing that occurs is memory fragmentation. So you experience something that, let's say, you didn't expect to experience. It was sort of traumatic. It was difficult for you to get through it completely in the moment, so you forget about it, right? A large um, aspect of trauma is forgetfulness. So when you fragment that piece of memory, right, it gets buried into the unconscious, and this is sort of like a self defense mechanism for the human mind, where the human mind is thinking, okay, like, I can't handle this amount of information right now, this bit of information, because it's way too traumatic and way too stressful. So it's putting my sanity under, strain, right? And it might end up in us becoming disillusioned with reality, or, outright, insane. We're approaching that threshold when something is super traumatic. So the mind buries it. It makes you forget the memory. It suppresses the memory. And you can then either bring that out through regressive hypnosis, or you can bring it out in the form of vision dreams in the future. That's why this stuff feels like remembrance, right? So, same thing here. Why does it do that? It's also important to mention. Well, the mind does that because the mind theorizes that in the future, let's say 5 years from, like, after the traumatic event occurred in your life. You will be stronger, smarter, more resourceful to deal with that issue when it pops back up again. So what it's doing is it's buying you time. Same thing on a collective level. When what we say a timeline shift occurred, it means some sort of collective trauma was experienced, and some sort of collective memory, therefore, was fragmented from the collective consciousness, pulled into the collective unconscious, right? Or subconscious, depending on the how visible the trauma, right? And once it was pulled down there, there's a delay effect, right? For us to get back to the status quo, we first now have to accept and deal with this collective trauma that we've all experienced together, for example, COVID, right? And there will be many years until COVID is readdressed from a point of non trauma, meaning like we've all gone through the COVID period. All of us somehow have been affected by it, and it's like we're still reeling from that experience, right? It's not like we can sit down and talk about COVID in a super pragmatic objective way because it's very recent. It's a recent kind of pain. So what a timeline shift, like what I would call a negative timeline shift, is that okay, some sort of fragmentation happened. And when what I call a positive timeline shift is that some sort of healing process has begun. So the subconscious memory, something from the past, it has reemerged again in a cyclical manner, and humanity has managed to accept it and sort of like integrate it into its collective whole.
So, what would be an example of a good timeline shift that has happened in our lifetime?
So that's a good question, and I think the good timeline shifts are very personal with like what kind of society we live in today. So anything that's on a global scale and very wholesome, which hasn't happened for a very long time, let's admit. Like when was the last time you heard news that like there's some war going on somewhere, let's say in some, I don't know, like African country, and both sides just decided to put down their weapons and hug it out, right? You never hear that on a global level. So it has to be on a personal level, on an individualized level, where these sort of like portal shifts happen on an auric field basis. And it is exactly these people, what I call like window souls, right? These high consciousness people who manage to transmute the sufferings and the torments of whatever negativity we've shifted into as a collective, to transmute them that and serve as a window into the future, right? By all means, these people are time travelers because they are interfacing with a higher form of consciousness from the future, that is buried in the highest potentiality of wherever we're going, and they can experience that on a visionary level and then reinterpret it back to the collective who is completely forgotten about that possibility. So yeah, it's on a more individualized, personal, and very rarely like a group or a commune level. But I would say overwhelmingly it's a personal thing.
So, you mentioned the COVID time. Would you say that was a major timeline shift? And then you said this is the third one. What was the first one? The first major timeline shift.
So in terms of recency, and there's several, and it's very difficult to basically like rank them, right? um in terms of intensity, because there's also like an individual bias element to it, where yes, if you're sensitive, you're going to feel these things, and if you're sensitive to what we call the paralogical, right, you're going to receive different bits of information on what's going on with the collective consciousness or unconscious, right? Some people are more naturally inclined to connect with the collective, conscious. Some people are more inclined to connect with, the more shadowy sides of it, like the more feminine sides of the phenomena. But to answer the question, I think like some of the very obvious major ones, 9/11 was a super major one because the whole world was struck by it, right? It was a huge one, had ritualistic elements, like sort of astrological, numerological alignment and stuff like that. And then you also have COVID, which largely I feel was at least partially like very manufactured, right? And that's why these are so effective, because they're sort of like directed. So to answer that question as well, we have the capacity, like each of us, to affect and impress ideas and plant seeds into one another's heads. Like I always bring the example of like, if I am yelling something, in your room, you can cover your ears, but that doesn't help very much. So it's almost like it's involuntary. So you have this involuntary status quo where we can just be super annoying on and super influential onto one another, and there's very little we can do, right? Um, so yeah, I think those two things were major shifts. This one, for example, that we said, it's still a large shift, but it's not like like it's not this incredible major shift, but it's still a significant shift. Like with the whole Venezuela thing and stuff, I think like whatever has you know a whole bunch of people on an international level sort of like coming together and reframing what reality is. Like for example, if the governments of the planet decide to do something absolutely egregious, right, then the collective becomes traumatized because it's a sort of like a disillusionment with reality. So you were like, well, I thought the world was like this and this and this, I thought the world was innocent, and in reality, right, what you're showing me is that the world has been very different from how I thought it was. So this causes some sort of traumatic dissonance, right? And you scaled it up on a collective level, and then you have the shift.
Okay. Oh, I thought we had someone up here, but I guess he just left. But okay, so what is the difference between a small timeline shift and a major one? Does that mean like when the timeline changes that there's different paths that the world can head into, and some of those paths are not available anymore?
That's also a great question. So there's only one destined path. So whatever is fated for this world, regardless of what happens, occurs each and every time. There's no way to change that because that's already been done in the higher realms. So our realm is basically like this manifested physical material echo plane. It's why I call it a mirror world of whatever is above. It's just that whatever is above has already occurred, right? But now it has to manifest and play itself out like a song, right? So that when you write a song, you write it on paper and it's already done, but then you have to play the song to actually experience it. So this is what's going on right now. The rest is like, let's call it improvisation. So you know what the beats of the song are, you know exactly where you're going, but you don't know how you're getting there. So what the timeline shift implies is that we've either approached, right, what we call the good timeline, or we've bought some more time, so to speak, and you know distance ourselves from it. So we picked a note on our collective instrument that is a little bit farther from where we need to go, but the final destiny of the world will be played out regardless. It's just like I said, it's a delaying mechanism, right? Mm, on a collective level.
Okay, so you're saying the end result, the fate, what's going to happen in the end is already predetermined, but the path to get there, uh, we could choose as a collective.
Yeah,
Right.
and obviously, like there are many options, so that there's many paths that you can take on an individual level. But as you live your life on an individualized basis, right, you also are subjected to, well, the whims and wishes of others. And when we live in a collective reality that is increasingly, the collective is increasingly choosing what I would call inaction, right? Then you have to arm yourself with the capacity to remain grounded. So it's not just an idea of like, oh, just turn off your TV and don't listen to anything. Da, da, da. If you're sensitive to this phenomenon, you're going to feel it literally in your bones wherever you are. You could be meditating somewhere, I don't know, on the highest peak of Earth, right? And you'd be still feeling the reverberations of this because you're connected to this collective field.
Okay, so what do you mean by people not taking action? What can be done, I guess, on the individual level? And if someone starts doing something, whatever that is, on the individual level, and if it spreads to enough people, like, what do you mean by inaction? I kind of don't understand that part.
So I mean inaction, the action as an action. So for example, sometimes inaction can be inaction. So let's say there's a bunch of military personnel in the world, no matter like what your beliefs are, no matter like whose side you're on, if you believe this side is righteous or that side is righteous, like who cares? There's a bunch of military personnel on this planet right now who have the choice of either saying yes to taking up weapons and uh, slaying other humans, or saying no and not taking up weapons and slaying other humans. So their inaction could also be an action within the framework, within the context of spiritual progress, collective spiritual progress. So because now the general idea, the general direction of events is something that's negatively impressing or impressing negative information upon the collective, we'll say that yes, I guess people chose inaction, they chose to experience it. It's really strange when you say it that way, but what I mean by choice is this, right? Like, um there are spiritual lessons to be learned in this life, and there are contingencies. So for someone who's unable to learn a certain spiritual level, or let's say us as a collective whole, right, we must go through specific scenarios and narratives in life that are going to show us in an exemplary manner why our belief systems are flawed, why we're doing this and this and that, and what the result of our choices as a collective is. So when you see a war occurring somewhere, right, and I'm sitting, in my house, wherever I am, I feel very disconnected from that event, but in truth, I'm experiencing that event as an exemplary symbol of learning, right? As a symptom of what the collective is going through, what the collective is going through.
Okay. Okay, I'm still a bit confused on
You
how
got
that. Okay,
it.
so you're saying there's a collective consciousness. I understand that. Are there different subconsciousness, collective subconsciousness in the whole collective consciousness, and how does that kind of play in all of it? Like, there's obviously the individual, there's the whole collective consciousness, and is there like other groups within that?
So there's a singular consciousness, but then, like we said, okay, I'll break it down into three parts because I realize this is a lot of like complex language. Um, there are some things called egregores, which is the closest thing that's Googleable to the concept I want to explain, which is a sort of like a pseudo sentient formation of energy that's fed by the belief of the collective. So, for example, if you and I opened, I don't know, like a carrot eating club or whatever, right? If we have 50 members joining the club, then that club is going to have some sort of consensus understanding of what the club is. And that consensus understanding is fed from what every member of the club believes the club to be, right? And this has to be formed in the etheric field, right? As a sort of a thought form. So when these beliefs come together and they clump up, they create what we call an egregore. So an egregore is a non-consciousness, but it's fueled by small subconsciousnesses, our individual consciousnesses as human beings, to exist on the immaterial plane as a sort of symbolic representation of what you and I have built, right? So the more people that are in this egregore and feeding their belief systems into this egregore, the larger and more influential it's going to get in the material world. A very strong egregore, for example, is any sort of sport. like let's say soccer or American football. Like I don't like soccer, or what Americans would call soccer, very much. I'm not interested in it, but I see it around me all the time, right? Because it's such a strong egregore. And let's remind ourselves like soccer isn't like, as a sport, it is not inherently included in the design of life. It's something that human beings made up. We made up a rule set. We made up, the jerseys, the balls, whatever. We built the stadiums, right? And it's a strong egregore that's basically captured the imagination of all of the people who play it. And there's people getting paid incredible amounts of money to play it, right? People, unfortunately, die, right, watching the sport or fighting over the sport. That's an incredibly potent egregore, but it's still an egregore because it's a human invention. It's not ingrained in the archetypal design of the world, right? So that's a good example of a very strong egregore. And a small egregore is like this, little corner bar you and your friends, secretly hang out at, every other evening, right? That's also an egregore.
Would you say that certain groups of people can push timelines in certain directions, and do they do it for a specific reason to serve a certain goal or maybe a certain entity, whatever it might be?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, that's why we're here. And that is possible on an influence level. That's why, like, a very large proponent of, well, social dynamics and, influence and so on and so forth. Its uttermost agenda is to become impressionable to as many human minds as you can, right? And that's why, let's say you would be considered an influential person in these circles, right? You're an influencer. You have, like, 100,000 followers, so on and so forth. So you have the capacity to reframe the understanding of reality as we're going through it for, many of your friends, your followers, so on and so forth. Now, how is that going to affect them? Now, that's a very big responsibility, right? One that you're sort of like carrying now in this space, right? So that's one way to affect it, one way to affect the whole, which is directly. And then there's another way to affect the whole as an exemplary existence, right? So you could be a nobody, you could be an absolute nobody, but you can gain glimpses of future timelines. You can gain glimpses of emotions and feelings and hidden truths and hidden meanings and information and so on by tapping into the future timeline. Why? Because the future timeline, let's call it the higher timeline, is always a higher state of spiritual and physical being, right, than the current one. So if you can tap into that and exist in this timeline, right? When we say, be in this world but not of this world, that's what we mean. That means you can exist in this higher state of being. You can have incredible information just downloaded into your frame, and then you can live your life according to the teachings and the knowings you gained from this higher timeline compared to the timeline now. So to the average person here in this timeline, you're going to look like someone who has access to an incredible array of of tools and meanings and symbols and information, right? That type of thing. But you also can't let it get to you, right? It can't be something that this sort of like spiritual status, let's call it that, is earned, because you have to be a certain level of fearless. You have to be hopelessly faithful. Let's say I call it that way, and you have to be able to discern different illusions, right? If you are capable of doing these things, and if you live your life, well, let's say attached to the future timeline, which means like your highest self, honesty, integrity, loyalty, so on and so all of these things that are special in this timeline are very average in the other one, right? But if you can match that, which is very difficult. So the more challenging this timeline gets, the more difficult it is to lead, let's say, a saint-like life, right? Because the environment becomes more toxic, the temptations become more intense, right? So now when we go farther from that, you're going to have uh, what we call masters, or guides, like spiritual guides, they're in this timeline having even a harder time maintaining their connection. Get it? But there will still be windows, of course.
Okay. And okay, so you're saying the way to ascend and the way to get glimpses to this higher timeline is live fearlessly. Like what are some, I guess, other examples of what, so just live morally. Is that basically what you're trying to say?
Yeah, in a very simplified manner, I would say yes. It's an earned respect, and to be authentic to yourself, right? If you know yourself to be a moral person, right? All the universe ever wants from you, from like a high level perspective, is for you to be authentic to your imprint, to be authentic to yourself. But that's a lot more difficult than people think, right? um, it means diving into your deepest desires. It means understanding the source, like the origin source of your ambitions. It means facing your fears. It means all of these things that make you into an exemplary person in your own, like your own understanding of it. And there are two forces that serve as the compass of life, right? There's what we call the lesser voice of God that lives within you, which is your conscience, right? And then there's the 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 whispering of the feminine mother, which is your intuition. So these two things, um you have to be aligned with these two forces, right? Meaning, if you do something that, let's say, this world, right, current timeline tells you, well, you know what, it's completely legal. Like, and if you go into a darker and darker timeline, right, we're going to, have laws and regulations and boundaries that are perhaps legal or legalized, but morally they're, let's say, unjust, right? So even if you do nothing that's illegal, but your conscience is telling you you shouldn't have done that, right? That's how you disconnect yourself from that higher reality. So let's say, even to come to an understanding of what the second coming is on a symbolic level, the second coming is a spontaneous and sudden awakening of ultimate conscience within all humans on earth. So if you lived, let's say, a righteous life, right, you will be okay with your conscience, right? If you know you've lived the life that was unrighteous by your own standards, because each soul, each human has an individualized rule of law within themselves, right? Some things are permitted for you, but they're not permitted for me. And some things are permitted for me that are not permitted for you. And it's the driving force of conscience that basically shows you what that is. And I know, like, usually we'll get the questions, we're like, well, some people might not have a conscience and they might not hear their conscience. Absolutely possible. Yes, some people might not hear their conscience at all, right? That means they will not spiritually progress.
Uh, So are there such things as soulless beings, like you said, the people who can't hear their consciousness, or is it just so dimmed in them that it got like knocked out of them? Or are some people just naturally born and here without a consciousness?
So that's a really cool question as well. Um, in terms of like a human being, right? Every human being is ensouled, so to speak. But there are different, like, there are varying degrees of spiritual progress and awareness and perspective. So let's say when you get smarter, right, or wiser or whatever, it's not that you retained more information, it's that you've reframed your understanding of what being smart is, right? So if you're someone who is completely disconnected from their intuition and their conscience and so on and so forth, completely, and usually this happens through trauma, right? Significant trauma. So it's either physical trauma that uh, damages the foundational mechanism through which you exist in this world. So it damages the radio, right? um, or some sort of traumatic emotional or psychological experience, then you can become fragmented from, your soul, so to speak. And if that gets buried completely, right, into the collective unconscious or subconscious, what we would call the null portal, or the void, right, that's when a human being would lose their grip on reality and they would dissolve into insanity, right? And for a person who is insane, there's no such thing as light and dark, good and bad, so on and so forth. They lose any understanding like of comparison. Like they lose their ability to even compare things in the sense of like what is orderly, what is chaotic, what is good, what is bad. So in very rare extreme cases, like super extreme cases, there could exist a human being right now on earth who is so completely disconnected that they could be technically considered, like they won't experience a soul to that, to any degree or level. Even with, okay, let's get into like some other stuff as well, but like even in the context of your demonology, right? And there's a lot of like woo woo topics in the occult fields and esoteric fields, and I know people who have been allegedly um, practicing, so dark magic or black magic or 10, 15 years, and even they don't understand what they're doing. Even they don't understand what the makeup of of their work is, right? But once you have a certain degree of having fallen into irreparable insanity, right? Um, that doesn't get lost in the informational field. That is still a thought form that exists in the unconsciousness, like the collective unconsciousness. So when we talk about demonology, and let's say, why are demons called aspects, or are angels called principalities, right? Because these are symbolic manifestations of that sort of darkness that exists in the collective mind. And there are ways one could connect or interface with, these unaware elements of the collective unconscious. So they're as ancient as quite literally anything else that exists. They're as ancient as us, and even more, because before you were aware, you were unaware, right? That type of thing. Um, so it's a very dark funnel, so to speak. But for a human to degrade and regress to that level is almost impossible, I think.
What about the people who are always doing the immoral thing, or they're always succumbing to greed, or they're always doing things that they know are wrong, but is whatever, giving them things in the material realm? Wouldn't you say there's quite a
Mhm.
few of those people out there in the world?
Yeah. So those are journeymen. Still, they're in the, like, you might think that's sort of like this outlier, but it's not. Most humans are rather selfish. Some people are more competent at being selfish in beneficial ways to them, right? But most people are selfish, and when you do engage in a lifestyle like that, the utter end, so your fated end, if you keep that up, is insanity. So the primary forces where we teach children, like dark and light, right, in life, in our world, if you want to get serious about it, uh, light and dark serve as complementary opposites. They're not like the night isn't bad and the day isn't good, right? Green isn't good and red isn't bad, right? They're just symbolic representations of a larger, greater truth. But the larger, greater truth is that these two forces that have gripped the human imagination are the forces of orderliness, order, awareness, and sanity, and insanity. So when you find out, like if you meditate on the idea of where each person goes, a person who is very immoral and causes, you know, hurt to others and behaves in an immoral way, obviously you will always end up at the end where they go insane. They have a disillusionment of reality, and the void consumes them. The void harvests them, so to speak. Um, but on a human and incarnational level, they'll have to do a lot of terrible things to even get to that point. Like they could interface with insanity in this life, right? But then in the next incarnation, they might try again or again or again, that type of thing. So it's all about. I don't even think you can get to that level, to that level of darkness, but it's definitely leading you one step closer to, you know, irrationality and insanity, right? Non-existence.
This is, I guess, a little off topic, but I guess at what point does a person's soul have to get to where they could get, possessed by demonic influences? Can that happen to anyone? Do you have to be at a certain low, I guess, lower vibration that these entities can come into you?
That's a great question too. So entities can possess human bodies, and most of the mythology that you have around, like from all around the world, about different entities and beings and sort of like different like strange occurrences that people have had. There's a plethora of information there. But to speak very generally, right? There is such a thing called the null portal, which is signified by the number zero in our world. So it's something that doesn't exist, but we can count it, right? So the null portal is the lowest point, right? The lowest point of um, thought you can go to, so to speak. And there are entities and there are beings that can peer into our world, but they are disembodied. Disembodied means they don't have a physical body to manifest into. They are incapable of doing it because of the nature, their own nature. But when you're able to possess someone, for example, as an entity would experience it, it is almost always someone who has struggled with this fragmentation that we talked about. So let's say when you drink alcohol, it goes into the seat of your soul, which is your blood, and your awareness, right, becomes dampened. Your egoic self, like your pupils dilate, your egoic self starts to take over, your animalistic self starts to take over. Now, this is temporary trauma, right, for the brain, for the mind. But when you have existing or chronic trauma, and when you have pieces of your consciousness that are fragmented due to this trauma and sent into the collective unconscious, right? Like think of it as a glass cup, right? That cup is filled with your awareness right now. You're fully aware of yourself, right? As you decrease that awareness, let's say with alcohol, like we made the example with, right? There's an empty space there in your awareness. And that empty space has to become filled with something because your awareness is not there. So what does it become filled with? Well, it becomes filled with all of the things that you are unaware of, firstly about yourself, and then about the collective darkness, right? And now, if you drain that awareness to a minimal level, then how to say, the dominant amount of whatever the glass is filled with, right, is a non awareness based force. And that force could be anything. So that is what we call possession. To become possessed by an aspect of the collective unknown to the degree where it can control your behaviors, motivations, desires, so on and so forth, right? And that is why trauma is the prerequisite for any sort of hypnosis, mental manipulation, psychic ability, all of these secret programs and stuff that are not so secret anymore, right? Because we know about them, right? That is why childhood trauma is an incredibly important element in these fields, right? Because they understand how consciousness works, the cup of consciousness, right?
How common would you say that is, someone being able to get possessed, or people being possessed? Is that a pretty common occurrence, or would you say that's pretty rare? And are there like different levels of entities that can possess you, or at different
Yes.
amount? Like, I guess you kind of explained how much the cup is full.
Yeah, there's a variety. and it has to do with familial links as well and intergenerational things. So it's not that like anyone can be accessed by anything, right? Genes matter, genealogy matters, and I would say incredibly rare when we're talking about like possession in the form of ongoing chronic, but incredibly rare in this day and age, incredibly rare. Even though we speak like in a negative sense of like, oh, we're traveling back into this, not so good timeline, or whatever, we as a species, morally and spiritually, have come an incredibly long way, where the average human today probably lives, on in a spiritual sense, a much better life than an average human 500, 600, 1000, 2000 years ago, right? So incredibly rare. But when it comes to temporary possession, which is more like, less like possession, but more like a cohabitation or coexistence with, a thing in your head, that is far more common, and a lot of practitioners, sort of like go through that, which is terrible idea, of course. But what's the game that came out? What's the game? Yeah, yeah, like that guy in Cyberpunk that's in your head. Like it's that sort of experience. But that's also insanity inducing.
Okay. You mentioned your genes matter, your ancestors matter. So is there like such a thing as, I guess, generational curses, and like if your ancestors did something so extremely immoral that it affects you today, and that you're, I guess, bearing their karma?
Yeah, so there's a soul cluster, so to speak. So uh, I always tell this to people where, um, if you knew like the characters in your life that you interact with like regularly, if you knew how many other quantum realities and how many lifetimes you've spent with those same people, you would turn into like an all loving person. Like, even us, like everyone who is in this call right now, at some point, because we're interlinking now, because we've crisscrossed in this conversation, even if you're not here live and you're just listening in like 5 days from now, right? It literally implies that we've, crossed in different lives lifespans, in different, lives, the same amount of times. So we're spirits that have had shared or common experiences, right? And that already is such a great fundament for cooperation and mutual respect and love and so on and so forth, right? Like, but to answer the question, yes, it matters, right? Your genealogy matters. Like the people you're born into, the people who are in your life, they're very significant for you. It's because you've gone through all of these, different lessons with them, several times over, and probably failed several times over and succeeded, the little victories or successes you might have had with them, like together. So all of that matters. It's not like, because if I do something terrible today, my grandchild is not going to, most likely in a material sense, not going to suffer from it, but they are going to be made up of the things that made me, right? And that genetic transfer has its own, like, it's why we're all different. Even like I mainly go with physiognomy, I do physiognomy and face reading, right? That's why we're all different in terms of visual appearance, because these temperaments are then translated into what you look like, what kind of, immune system you're born with, everything, right? So all of these things are obviously interconnected, and you can have a lot of very smart and very clever people who study these isolated elements of like how they're interconnected to talk to, and they'll blow your mind, right? Like whoever you talk to who's like a true professional or expert in their field, they'll explain how everything is interconnected. So it's like, I always ask people that question first thing, about, can you explain to me how everything is interconnected in your field of work, right? And it, like, anyone who's an expert in their field will tell you, yeah, like, how did you know that? Like, how? Yes, of course it's interconnected. So everything is interconnected.
Okay. If anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to come up as well. This has been going pretty well, but yeah, we'll keep it up for a bit more. I think we covered a decent amount of topics, but again, if anybody has questions about what Jack was saying, feel free to join. Um, for the people who I guess don't know who you are, you mainly do physiognomy, and I remember a post that you posted. This guy who took a picture of himself every day for like years, and he looked exactly the same, which was absolutely mind boggling to me. But is that something that is pretty common, or would you say most people do evolve? And what does that mean? Like, did he not go through any trauma in his life throughout those years? Did he just stay completely stagnant?
Mm. So and I don't know who that person is. And like when I made the post, I was a little bit mean. So apologies to whoever that person is. Like I have nothing against them. It's just good material for to give like a good example. And basically, like what that means is they haven't really internalized their experiences or their life lessons, right? Like you go through things, obviously, and some people just like I feel like they just flow through things. Like it's like something will happen to them, like some sort of misfortune or what they would call misfortune, right? But like in let's say a higher spiritual understanding, we understand that misfortune doesn't exist, right? Everything is some sort of spiritual lesson to you. So when you go through life, and obviously there are challenges and temptations, and there's difficult moments and good moments, and so on and so forth. When you go through these experiences, right, they're obviously imprinted onto like your being. But if you don't internalize them and like and become self-analytical and well, you know do the math, so to speak, you're going to remain very baby faced, right? You see that in the Western Hemisphere, you see that a lot more. That people that are a lot more careless about life, they're very baby faced, right? And which is great because they have a lesser, um, they have less stress, less inflammation, like less chronic inflammation, bodily inflammation, right? Like stress is the trigger for these things, but they also have a certain strange unawareness of whatever lesson life is trying to teach them because they don't see it that way. They just see it, they just register it in the form of like, well, I got unlucky today and tomorrow I'm going to get lucky. And the next day I might get unlucky again. Right. So it's up to the person to determine the ultimate meaningfulness of their experience here in this world, to ask the questions they need to ask, and so on and so forth. So when your face doesn't change, right, we call it the deviations layer. So you have the imprint layer on your face, which is the genetic markers you were imprinted with. And before you even were imprinted with the genetic markers, you were imprinted with evolutionary markers. And on top of that, then there's the genetic markers, which shows your like mental mapping. It shows your temperament. It shows all of these different things about you, right? Like how do you think? What are your skills? What are your temperament? Right? Stuff like that. And then there's the deviations layer, that precedes the intuitive layer, and the deviations layer basically shows what emotions have you been wearing on your face, and it's an input output mechanism. It's an input output system, meaning if I'm angry all the time for a duration of 10 years, right, then my face is going to the musculature on my face is going to reshape into an angry face. And if I'm wearing an angry face at all times, even when I'm not angry, I'm going to feel angry because my body is communicating to my mind and through my mind to my soul that I am currently experiencing an angry form of existence, right? So it goes back and forth. So when you input it, then it'll be outputted back onto your physiognomy. So when a person doesn't go through those motions, right? So what is a face of wisdom or a learned physiognomy or a wise physiognomy? It's someone you see that they have been through periods of significant anger or disappointment or jealousy and this and that, and then they've sort of liberated themselves and healed from those moments, and then they wear the scars of those experiences that they've had. So you're looking at a person who's been through a lot of stuff. They've been through a lot of stress. There's sort of like an immune response associated with that. But you want to see that in a person who's been recording, like, let's say 20 years of their life, right, with a picture every other day. But When you don't see that, it's like, have we really learned much? Probably not, right?
Yeah, yeah, that definitely makes sense. All right, Christianity and the Third Reich. Go
What a name.
ahead.
Hey, have any of you ever gone down the Paul Stobbs rabbit hole about the Nephilim clown theory? It's pretty interesting. You guys heard of it?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, I
What?
think there's definitely something to it. So he believes that the Nephilim, the fallen angels from the Book of Enoch, that they looked like clowns. So if you look at Asian like demon masks, they look like clowns. If you look at old depictions of Medusa, she looks like a clown. There's even tribes who have barely, like in Papua New Guinea, who barely have any contact with the outside world. They wear like clown kind of makeup, that pale white with a red nose. So his like theory is that people dressing like clowns or whatever, and also in the DNT realm, people always see jesters and things like that. So the clowns are pretty much a representation of what demons actually look like. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Um, so it's an interesting theory, but I'm more of a pragmatist with these things. I believe everything has a preset function. So even if, like, let's say the theory rings true, or whatever, what function does it serve within the context of the meaning of life, which is, like, let's say, uh, spiritual learning. So if you ask me, like, when you do like an intuitive face reading, right, everyone looks like a clown, because when you look at the face, it's sort of like a constant fractal realignment of energy, and it has coloration. It has these lines coming out of the face, stuff like that. So to me, like, anyone could look like a clown. So I don't believe, like we said before, like, Nephilim demons, anything that is disembodied and is capable of possession, right? To possess a sort of like a sentient vessel, right? That is presented to us in a visual way, how the collective has imagined them to be, right? So the collective consensus has a very large effect on how these things are manifested. So if all of us on planet Earth suddenly believe that clowns are demons, then when people start experiencing demons, they will start experiencing clowns, because that is how the collective unconscious will become visually manifested. If they're printed into this world, they must, like, it's a rule of this realm that if they're printed into this world, they must have some sort of visual representation. You were also printed into this world. You just happen to be a little bit more dense than everything else that was printed into this world, right? And you look like yourself because that is how you know imagined yourself to be, right? You're a good representation of the archetypal energetic creational force you represent on a cosmic level, right? I don't know if I've answered the question, but
Yeah, I mean, there are different cultures who never could have met. We're all doing the same thing, and the practical application is you're people who are, I don't know, dressing as clowns for Halloweens or engaging in any of this stuff. They are inviting demons in. So I think that's the practical use of it.
mm. Well, yeah, I think that could be like, I believe, like, it doesn't matter if these cultures don't interconnect, like, physically, right? Because it's not like you gain understanding of this information on a physical basis anyway, like on a material basis. I think you experience the etheric realm and the subtle realms and the astral realm, in, like, individually removed, but you still are experiencing the same phenomena, right? Regardless of who you are and where you are, you're still experiencing the same phenomena on an astral level. And then it's your reinterpretation of this phenomena that probably, has, like, its own cultural elements, right? Let's say, for example, different Slavic countries have a different understanding of Krampus, right? Krampus is like this, like, holiday demon. It's like really this furry, tall, scary, disgusting looking thing, right? And all of them have, like, slight differences, right, depending on, like, which Slavic country you visit or which Slavic culture you talk to, right? But they are very, like, obviously from the same source. channeled from the same source.
All right. Hey, gentlemen, thanks for your time. I'll drop down. Great show.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks
sir.
for coming on. So where does like you gave Krampus as an example? Where does that stem from? Like where do they get that from?
The collective unconscious.
But what is that like manifested from? What are they trying to? What does that mean?
That's also a cool question. So there is an archetypal symbology that follows these things, but then there's also the human experience of it. So for example, right, why would a demon look like half of an animal, half of this, half of that? It's the result of human imagination within the frame of what is the most disgusting thing I can imagine. You understand what I'm saying, right? So it has a archetypal meaning, the symbol of the goat, for example. It has an archetypal meaning, but what we would call a true name, right? That is pre-existing, and that's why humans feel naturally inclined to use this archetypal symbol when they're imagining something that brings about disgust or some sort of wretchedness or deceit or so on and so forth. But all of these demonic entities and so on and so forth, they're from this void space of human imagination. So it goes both ways. The tree of life goes both ways, right? The more beautiful things you can imagine, equally the more horrendous and terrifying things you can imagine, right? And that constantly increases sort of like the horizon of where humanity can possibly go, that type of thing.
And where does the beauty and I guess evil stem from? I understand it's people imagining it. For example, Krampus, or but where does the actual beauty stem from, and what does it mean? What does it mean to be beautiful?
That's also a good question. um so I would say what it means to be beautiful is to be in alignment, and that's different. Like I'll use physiognomy as an example, right? It's different for everyone. So we have two types of imprints. So let's say if you have what we would call a positive imprint or a virtuous imprint, right? Let's say you are someone who is naturally very symmetrical in the face. Let's say you're someone who has what we call willful synergies, right? And positive synergies, which are like these facial traits that people naturally have. If you have all of these positive traits, then let's say a face reading guide would tell you you need to lean into this more. You need to lean into your energy more, right? The more you embody the imprint that you have, the more charismatic, influential, beautiful, attractive, authentic you will be, right? But then there's the tricky part, which is sort of like the feminine element of the experience with one's physiognomy, which is what we call wrathful synergies. And a wrathful synergy is if someone has a sly face, if someone has an angry face, if someone has a meek disposition, right? Then we would tell them you need to embody the absolute opposite of what your imprint is. And why do we do that? Because their charm, their charisma, their aura, their energy, their attraction, right, lies at the opposite end of what their imprint is. So if you have, like, for example, right, if you link these archetypal energies, like people who have a lot of Saturnian energy, they tend to have a lot of wrathful features. So they have to embody the absolute opposite of that. Like if someone naturally has a, you know, I don't know, like a dishonest face, I would tell them never be dishonest. Be as honest as you possibly can. Embody. If you have an angry face, be calm, be peaceful, talk to people on a diplomatic basis, right? If someone has a face that makes them look a little bit dirty, then you need to embody cleanliness, purity, clarity, that type of thing, right? It's all about understanding what your imprint is and what dominant features you have on your physiognomy, and according to that, you can reframe your understanding of what beauty is, because beauty is not symmetry, contrary to popular opinion. Beauty is authentic expression, right? When you take your imprint and you take authentic expression overlaid on top of that imprint, that's what creates energy. So you could have and I'm sure everyone's met a person like this at least once in their lives. You could have a woman that's not particularly, beautiful in a classical sense, but her mannerisms and her behaviors and her femininity and how she carries herself makes her incredibly sexy. And then you can meet a man who's not particularly handsome, or whatever, they might not be like super tall or whatever is considered like culturally like attractive today, but even symmetrically, like objectively, right? But they can have incredible aura, and they can even have more aura than someone who is incredibly symmetrical, because they have an understanding of the imprint that they carry, and they embody the opposite of that. So that gives them this mystique, this mysteriousness of like, well, if someone is looks very weak but they behave like they're incredibly strong and they can move mountains, that mystique is unattainable for someone who already looks good, right? And then you wonder like, well, why are they so confident? how are they how do they feel so good about themselves? And that is what gives them this incredible auric field. So yeah, I think physiognomy is a really good example for that.
Okay. I don't want to keep bombarding you with questions, but I had one more topic.
All good.
Yeah, I had one more topic because right now physiognomy is kind of, I guess, going mainstream, but I feel like people's understanding of physiognomy is kind of flawed. And you probably see on your timeline all the, kind of looks maxing people changing their, I guess, imprint, whatever they might be doing with surgery, or they're doing bone smashing, whatever they might be doing. How does that affect your aura, and how does that just affect you in general?
So I think like we said, it's like an input output thing. So obviously, like I always make the example, like if you take a tooth out and it changes what you look like, then obviously your inner realm also suffers, so to speak, right? It changes, and it's not all the time like bad, right? It's not just negative. But when I the most saddening stories are like when you see someone who has like a really strong nose, for example, or someone has like a really strong, like I don't know, some other feature of their face, and then they like get it quote unquote fixed. Yeah, it's like they're just causing this weird misalignment with all these gifts that they're supposed to have. And I understand that they might not like it, but the experience of them not liking this feature and them having to embody the absolute opposite of that would have given them so much more power and agency in this world, right? So but even that is a choice, and yes, you can like reframe from one state of being and how you are to another by doing that. But also it will demand of you, like this is super important, like it will demand of you then to mentally and emotionally and spiritually and psychically become the person that you molded yourself into from the outside. And usually, when that demand comes, because remember, it's not in their natural imprint. So, when the demand comes from life, when people start treating you like that person that you've molded yourself into, and you don't have the inner know how and the inner resource, right? And the competence level to actually achieve that person, that's when they get into real trouble. And especially if they're young, especially if they're inexperienced. So to achieve that person, sometimes they can't. That new person, right? Sometimes they can't achieve that, and that sends them on a completely different path of temptation and learning and so on. It is possible, but it's really difficult, and I don't advise it as well, because the imprint that you were born with, it's meant to speak to you. It's meant to show you who and what you are. And if there's any like young men, especially young men listening in, understand that attraction and beauty have very little to do with just symmetry and just visuals. Attraction and beauty has everything to do with how you are expressing on top of your existing imprint, right? Like we said, if you have a dishonest face, be unapologetically honest. If you have a sad face, be unapologetically happy. Embrace happiness. It's not that like fake it, but embrace it, right? I used to be, people used to tell me that, I scared them a little bit. I have an intense stare. I have a sort of an angry face, right? So after I learned this, I started talking to people very calmly and made them feel as safe as I possibly could, and very gently, even people who didn't deserve it, right? And my experience of like how I interface with other people completely changed. I haven't had any issues since then. And before that, I was in a street fight every second day because of it. Because I would look at someone that would look back at me, and then I would double down right on the imprint, because of you get pissed off or you get irritated, right? Like, hey, why are you pissed off at me for no reason, right? And then you really get pissed off and you embody this negative imprint that you have, and it just spirals out of control. But like I said, I've never had a physical altercation since then, like never, like not even once.
Okay. Okay, I think that's a good point to end off on. Jack, thanks for coming on. I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed. That was an interesting conversation. Obviously different than what I usually talk about, but hopefully that was enlightening. Do you want to say anything else to end off on?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hermes, for having me on. I appreciate you, sir. You have, wonderful youthful energy. You have big responsibility on your back, and I wish you, to be authentic to yourself, and to be passionate, and to be strong and open-minded, humble to life. Thanks for everyone for listening in. Obviously, some really sophisticated, complex topics we're exploring. Again, a little bit pretentious, but I promise you there is an incredible amount of depth that we just can't cover in like a 2 hour conversation. But to keep looking, and to keep an open mind and eyes, and so on and so forth, understand that there's meaning behind your life, and what you do is of ultimate importance. um, Even if it doesn't feel like it, right? If you learn the lessons of the soul, you're going to advance. We're all going to make it. So much love, everyone.
Perfect way to end it off. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Bye bye.